Hey guys, Coach Logan here again with part 3 of my series on the elements of chess. This video I want to talk about pawn structure. We'll just jump right into it. Pawn structure refers to kind of the layout of what your pawns look like, right? When we start the game, they start in this position, but over the course of the game, through trades and captures, they're going to change their position, right? Or even just not even through trades and captures, even if they just move. And the way that the pawns are laid out really has a profound impact on what the position plays like and what your goals can be, right? So let's take a look. This one's kind of an extreme example, but it comes from the Scotch opening. So let's take a look how this would go. Pawn to e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and here white plays the move pawn to d4. Black captures, white captures back, and one of the main lines for black in this position, he has a few different moves, but one of the main lines, one of the more respected lines is bishop to c5, just developing a new piece. White also has a couple of options here, but one of the more popular ones is the move bishop to e3. And now white sort of has a threat. This bishop on c5 is loose, so like if black is not careful, say they play something like, I don't know, knight f6 would be an example of a really bad move because white has a little tactic here. You can pause the videos if you want to try to solve it, but this is not really a tactics video. White could play knight takes c6, attacking the black queen, but the problem is after black recaptures, this bishop is hanging, so white just wins a piece. So black should probably do something about that. There's a few good moves for black. I think the main one is actually queen to f6. But one mistake I've seen kids make quite a fair amount is they'll play the move pawn to d6 here, which defends the bishop on c5, so it's no longer technically loose, but it doesn't defend it in a great way, because now white can continue with this same idea and capture the knight on c6. After which he's hitting the black queen. So black's not in time to play something like bishop takes e3 because white will just capture the queen. But if black recaptures the knight, which is really all that he can do, now white still takes the bishop on c5. Black recaptures, and what we see is that black's pawns on the c file are really, really bad. Okay, they're bad because they are stacked one on top of the other, right? So, those of you who are coming to this video, you've probably heard of terms before like isolated pawns or backwards pawns or doubled pawns. These are tripled isolated pawns. In other words, it's not just doubled, they're not just 1, 2, it's 1, 2, 3. And they're isolated, meaning there's no pawn on either the D file nor the B file that could, play support for any of these. So these are very, very weak. So for instance here, after say something like queen takes d8 check, let's say king takes d8, I think honestly in a matter of a couple of moves, black might even just be losing some of these pawns. Let's just say we make some natural moves here, like knight to c3, let's go knight f6. I'm trying to make these like reasonable moves, not like crazy ones. Let's say white castles with check. Black moves the king. White probably has better moves than this right now, but just to keep this simple, let's say white plays knight to a4, attacking this pawn on c5. Already you're seeing that this is becoming difficult to defend, right? Like if black could just magically say move this pawn sideways to b6, then it would solve their problems with with the c pawn. But they can't do that, right? That's not an option. Pawns don't go sideways in chess. So it's already becoming difficult to defend this. I think black would have to play a move like knight to d7. Just note that tactically speaking, they should not play knight takes e4. Again, pause your videos if you want to see why, or if you want to try to figure out why, but I'll just show you because, again, it's not really a tactics video. Rook to e1 would pin the knight. The knight can't move because it's pinned to the king, and if black defends it, white can just put pressure on the pinned piece via f3. So that's no good. But black would have to defend this pawn with something not ideal, like knight to d7. And again, white probably has better moves than what I'm doing, but this is just to directly show the point. After something like rook to d3, as crude as it is, I don't really see what black is going to do to deal with rook to c3, attacking the pawn again, and then just knight taking it. These pawns are really, really weak, right? So now, I've seen a lot of people kind of try to break down what weak pawns are into like different categories, like for instance the doubled pawns that we have here, or sorry, these are triple pawns, but same concept, or backwards pawns or isolated pawns. But really, I think that the two defining characteristics of weak pawns are that one is that they can be attacked, right? So a lot of times if you see pawns that are, you'll get pawns, for instance, sometimes, let me just show another example really quick. But say, for instance, this is actually a branching off of my Caro-Kann series. But after something like knight c3, d4, d5, knight f3, don't get too caught up in the opening ideas again. That's not really the point of this. For instance, if black plays the move d4, then after knight to e2, I would argue that the d4 pawn is actually a little bit weak, even though it's not doubled, it's not isolated, it's not backwards, but just because it's a pawn that's getting attacked and it's requiring resources to defend it, right? Now, black can do that. Black can play stuff like c5, but again, even after c3, it gets attacked again. And if black were to just keep on pushing it, after knight f4, again, it's getting attacked, and while it's not, one of what we think of with traditionally weak pawns, it's still a weak pawn because it's able to be attacked. So that's one characteristic of weak pawns, is that they can be attacked. The other one that I think is also very, very important, and maybe even more important, and it's one that I think that kids and newer players have a difficulty understanding and internalizing. Weak pawns are pawns that are immobile, that can't move, right? Or at least that can't move in a productive way. So to really show an example of this, I'm actually going to jump to a different position. So let me just pull up the position first. So we'll click out of this, and here we go. So we got this other position here. This pawn skeleton, as I like to call it, came from a recent ICN online game between two students, and this position didn't actually arrive on the board, but the pawn structure was in the position. In the game, there were other pieces on the board, and there were some mistakes on both sides, and things didn't go perfectly, but the pawn structure was here. And so what I want to do is take a look just at this type of pawn structure with the king and pawn endgame. Now, so take a minute and look at this and tell me, try to think like what you notice about the pawn structure here. I'm just going to have a sip of my water and you take a moment to think about it. Okay, so what you've probably seen is that black has doubled pawns on the f-file, right? Now, these pawns, while they're doubled, they are by no means weak in the sense that white can easily attack them, right? First of all, it's going to be hard for us to attack them because how do you do that, right? We would need to be able to get our king, all the way up somewhere like e7 or e8. But black's king gets moves too. They're not going to let us in there easily. And these pawns are not, they're not weak like that, right? If you were to remove this pawn, say you remove the g7 pawn somehow, then I would argue these pawns could be weak because they're not really, it's hard to defend them. You're going to need the king to babysit both of them at all times. But as they are like this, I just don't think these pawns are actually that weak in the sense that they can be targeted. However, because they are doubled, they are somewhat immobile, which is the other type of problem with weak pawns with pawn structure that I was talking about, which means that they can't move so easily, right? Because they're doubled, they sort of just kind of clunk into each other like this, or actually they're going in the same direction, so it's kind of like that. But yeah, so the problem with this is let's just see how this endgame would play out. So the first thing you should do in any endgame is activate your king, right? So, or at least in most endgames, yeah, you should be activating your king. So say king f1 from white. Let's say we get some symmetry from black. These moves are all pretty logical. White heads kind of towards the queen side where he has a majority. Black mobilizes and holds it. Okay, so we've reached kind of the first stage of this. Now, let's say that it's black's move. So black has a majority on the king side. So let's say he tries to start pushing that. Let's say something like F5, right? Makes some sense. Okay, I would argue now that, like, okay, white could just keep going on the queen side with C4, but just to show the point, let's say white plays F4 here, right? How is black going to try to make any progress? They could play, let's say they play something like F6. Now it's white's turn, so I would say white should start mobilizing his majority. Generally, you want to start with the pawn that is not blocked. We call that the candidate pawn. So let's start with C4. Let's say black now plays G5, right? So what would you do here as white? Okay. There's more than one right answer, but the thing you definitely do not want to do is take this pawn. This would be a disaster because you would be undoubling black's pawns. Black would use this doubled F pawn to recapture, and now he has a healthy majority again, meaning no doubled pawns, and these are mobile. These can start moving. F4, H5, G4, F3, right? These pawns will start coming down the board to try to make a passed pawn. White, though, what white should do is probably the simplest and the best thing is just defend this pawn with pawn to G3 and just hold this pawn here. We are not concerned at all if black takes us. If black takes us, all that's going to happen is this single pawn is going to be stopping two black pawns on the F file. Black probably won't want to do that because that makes our task easy. So let's say they play something like H5. Now, how can we shut down this entire king side for just permanently? Okay, again, keep your video paused if you want more time, but I think the best way is just to play H4, okay? And now, whichever way black wants to capture or push, basically this entire king side is going to be frozen, right? So let's just say they push, right? Or we can say they capture either pawn, it doesn't matter. Let's say they take, we take. These pawns are all stopped, while white's are not. White still has a healthy majority over here on the queen side. So just to show how this might play out, let's say black doesn't want to move his king because that lets us enter, so something like B6. White's going to keep mobilizing. Let's say black, I don't know, either A6 or A5. Okay, at this point, white can make a pass pawn with C5. And the reason this is so powerful is, just say black captures, white takes. Black can try to keep us out, but we will just outweight them, right? Again, black doesn't want to move his king because that will let us enter, right? Like if they go something like king d7, our king starts to break in and we start to go after these pawns. But the problem is they're going to run out of moves. So after something like a5, we can just play a4 and black now has to make a move and white is going to enter, right? White has several different ways to win now. I mean, truthfully, in this position, like after something like king d7, white can even just come in and take this a5 pawn, maybe. Well, but probably actually even better is just to go king d5, as they're pointing out. And we can push this pawn forward, forcing black back. And now, again, white has different ways to go about this, but I think just one of the easiest is just to go and take these pawns now. Black is going to be far too slow to deal with us. And white is now going to collect these pawns that before they were hard to attack, but now because we sort of push their king away, we can just take those, we move our king out of the way, and our pawn will go 1, 2, 3, 4 down the board and turn into a new queen, after which we should be able to win. Okay, so there's a little bit of technical stuff to handle in this, but the big strategic point, if we go back to the starting position, was that even though black's pawns were not at all obviously easy to attack, the fact that they were somewhat blocked by their mobility was stunted by dint of their being doubled. This was a huge problem for black, and in fact just made this a losing position, even though the pawns don't seem weak, right? So okay, so that's a good start for this, and I think thinking about pawns and pawn structure in that way can really help your chess. Think about pawns being weak in that they can be attacked, or pawns being immobile in that they can't really be used aggressively. Those are two big things that can help you understand long-term pawn structure.